Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Preparations for Arson. On one excuse or another, Steerpike absented himself from the prune squalors during the major part of the next 2 days. Although he accomplished many things during this short period, the 3 stealthy expeditions which he made to the library were the core of his activities. The difficulty lay in crossing, unobserved, the open ground to the conifer wood. Once in the wood and among the pines there was less danger. He realized how fatal it might prove to be in the neighborhood of the library, so shortly before the burning. On the first of the reconnaissance, after waiting in the shadows of the southern wing before scudding across the overgrown gardens to the fields that bordered the conifers, he gathered the information which he needed. He had managed, after an hour's patient concentration, to work the lock of the library door with a piece of wire, and then he had entered the silent room to investigate the structure of the building. There was a remoteness about the deserted room. Shadowy and sinister though it was by night, it was free of the vacancy which haunted its daylight hours. Steerpike felt the insistent silence of the place as he moved to and fro, glancing over his high shoulder more than once as he took note of the possibilities for conflagration. His survey was exhaustive, and when he finally left the building he appreciated to a nicety the nature of the problem. Lengths of oil-soaked material would have to be procured and laid behind the books where they would stretch unobserved from one end of the room to the other. After leading around the library, they would be taken up the stairs and along the balcony. To lay these twisted lengths, no easy matter to procure without awakening speculation, was patiently a job for those hours of the early morning, after Lord Sepulchrave had left for the castle. He had staggered on his second visit under an enormous bundle of rags and a tin of oil to the pine wood at midnight, and had occupied himself during the hours while he waited for Lord Sepulchrave to leave the building in knotting together the odd assortment of pilfered cloth into lengths of not less than 40 feet. When at last he saw his lordship leave the side door and heard his slow, melancholy footsteps die away on the pathway leading to the Tower of Flints, he rose and stretched himself. Much to his annoyance, the probing of the lock occupied even more time than on the last occasion, and it was 4 o'clock in the morning before he pushed the door open before him. Luckily, the dark autumn mornings were on his side, and he had a clear 3 hours. He had noticed that from without no light could be observed, and he lit the lamp in the centre of the room. Steerpike was nothing if not systematic, and 2 hours later, taking a tour of the library, he was well satisfied. Not a trace of his handiwork could be seen save only where 4 extremities of the cloth hung limply beside the main, unused door of the building. These strips were the terminals of the 4 lengths that circumscribed the library and balcony and would be dealt with. The only thing that caused him a moment's reflection was the faint smell of the oil in which he had soaked the tightly twisted cloth. He now concentrated his attention upon the 4 strips, and twining them together into a single cord, he knotted it at its end. Somehow or other this cord must find its way through the door to the outside world. He had on his last visit eventually arrived at the only solution, apart from that of chiselling a way through the solid wall and the oak that formed the backs of the bookshelves. This was obviously too laborious. The alternative, which he had decided on, was to bore a neat hole through the door immediately under the large handle in the shadow of which it would be visible save to scrutiny. Luckily for him, there was a reading stand in the form of a carven upright with 3 short, bulbous legs. The upright supported a tilted surface the size of a very small table. This piece stood unused in front of the main door. By moving it a fraction to the right, the twisted cord of cloth was lost in darkness, and although its discovery was not impossible, both this risk and that of the faint aroma of oil being noticed were justifiable. He had brought the necessary tools with him, and although the oak was tough, had bored its way through it within half an hour. He wriggled the cord through the hole and swept up the sawdust that had gathered on the floor. By this time he was really tired, but he took another walk about the library before turning down the lamp and leaving by the side door. Once in the open, he bore to his right, and skirting the adjacent wall, arrived at the main door of the building. As this entrance had not been used for many years, the steps that led to it were invisible beneath a cold sea of nettles and giant weeds. He waded his way through them and saw the loose ends of the cord hanging through the raw hole he had chiselled. It glimmered whitely and was hooked like a dead finger. Opening the blade of a small sharp knife, he cut through the twisted cloth so that only about 2 inches protruded, and, to prevent this stub end slipping back through the hole, drove a small nail through the cloth with the butt of his knife. His work for the night now seemed to be complete, and only stopping to hide the can of oil in the wood, he retraced his steps to the prune squalors, where, climbing at once to his room, he curled up in bed, dressed as he was, and incontinently fell asleep. The third of his exhibitions to the library, the second during the daylight, was on other business. As might be supposed, the childishness of burning down Lord Sepulchreve's sanctum did not appeal to him. In a way, it appalled him. Not through any prickings of conscience, but because destruction of any form annoyed him. That is, the destruction of anything inanimate that was well constructed. For living creatures he had not this same concern, but in a well-made object, whatever its nature, a sword or a watch or a book, he felt an excited interest. He enjoyed a thing that was cleverly conceived and skilfully wrought, and this notion of destroying so many beautifully bound and printed volumes had angered him against himself, and it was only when his plot had so ripened that he could neither retract nor resist it that he went forward with a single mind. That it should be the twins who would actually set light to the building with their own hands was, of course, the linchpin of the manoeuvre. The advantages to himself which would accrue from being the only witness to the act were too absorbing for him to ponder at this juncture. The aunts would, of course, not realize that they were setting fire to a library filled with people, nor that it would be the night of the great gathering to which, as Steerpike had told them, they were not to be invited. The youth had waylaid Nanny Slag on her way to the aunts, and had inquired whether he could save her feet by delivering her message to them. At first she had been disinclined to divulge the nature of her mission, but when she at last furbished him with what he had already suspected, he promised he would inform them at once of the gathering, and, after a pretence of going in their direction, he had returned to the prune squalors in time for his midday meal. It was on the following morning that he told the twins that they had not been invited. Once Cora and Clarice had ignited the cord at the main door of the library and the fire was beginning to blossom, it would be up to him to be as active as an eel on a line. It seemed to Steerpike that to save 2 generations of the House of Groan from death by fire should stand him in very good stead, and moreover, his headquarters would be well established in the south wing with their ladyships Cora and Clarice, who after such an episode would, if only through fear of their guilt being uncovered, eat out of his hand. The question of how the fire started would follow close upon the rescue. On this he would have as little knowledge as anyone, only having seen the glow in the sky as he was walking along the south wing for exercise. The prune squalors would bear out that it was his habit to take a stroll at sundown. The twins would be back in their room before news of the burning could ever reach the castle. Steerpike's third visit to the library was to plan how the rescues were to be effected. One of the first things was, of course, to turn and remove the key from the door when the party had entered the building, and as Lord Sepulchrave had the convenient habit of leaving it in the lock until he removed it on retiring in the small hours, there should be no difficulty about this. That such questions as who turned the key and how did it disappear would be asked at a later date was inevitable, but with a well-rehearsed alibi for himself and the twins, and with the prune squaller's cognizance of his having gone out for a stroll on that particular evening, he felt sure that the suspicion would no more centre upon himself than on anyone else. Such minor problems as might arise in the future could be dealt with in the future. This was of more immediate consequence. How was he to rescue the family of Groan in a manner reasonably free of danger to himself and yet sufficiently dramatic to cause the maximum admiration and indebtedness? His survey of the building had shown him that he had no wide range of choice. In fact, that apart from forcing one of the doors open by some apparently superhuman effort at the last moment, or by smashing an opening in the large skylight in the roof through which it would be both too difficult and dangerous to rescue the prisoners, the remaining possibility lay in the only window, 15 feet from the ground. Once he had decided on this window as his focus, he turned over in his mind alternative methods of rescue. It must appear above all else that the deliverance was the result of a spontaneous decision, translated at once into action. It did not matter so much if he were suspected, although he did not imagine that he would be. What mattered was that nothing could later be proved as prearranged. The window, about 4 feet square, was above the main door and was heavily glazed. The difficulty naturally centred on how the prisoners were to reach the window from the inside, and how Steerpike was to scale the outer wall in order to smash the pane and show himself. Obviously, he must not be armed with anything which he would not normally be carrying. Whatever he used to force an entrance must be something he had picked up on the spur of the moment outside the library or among the pines. A ladder, for instance, would at once arouse suspicions, and yet something of that nature was needed. It occurred to him that a small tree was the obvious solution, and he began to search for one of the approximate length, already felled, for many of the pines which were cleared for the erection of the library and adjacent buildings were still to be seen lying half buried in the thick, needle-covered ground. It did not take him long to come upon an almost perfect specimen of what he wanted. It was about 12 to 15 feet long, and most of its lateral branches were broken off close to the bole, leaving stumps varying from 3 inches to a foot in length. "Here," said Steerpike to himself, "is the thing." It was less easy for him to find another, but eventually he discovered some distance from the library what he was searching for. It lay in a dank hollow of ferns. Dragging it to the library wall, he propped both the pines upright against the main door and under the only window. Wiping the sweat from his bulging forehead, he began to climb them, stamping off those branches that would be too weak to support Lady Groan, who would be the heaviest of the prisoners. Dragging them away from the wall when he had completed these minor adjustments, and feeling satisfied that his ladders were now both serviceable yet natural, he left them at the edge of the trees, where a number of felled pines were littered, and next cast about for something with which he could smash the window. At the base of the adjacent building, a number of moss-covered lumps of masonry had fallen away from the walls. He carried several of these to within a few yards of the ladders. Were there any question of his being suspected later, and if questions were raised as to how he came across the ladders and the piece of masonry so conveniently, he could point to the heap of half-hidden stones and the litter of trees. Steerpike closed his eyes and attempted to visualize the scene. He could see himself making frantic efforts to open the doors, rattling the handles and banging the panels. He could hear himself shouting, "Is there anybody in there?" and the muffled cries from within. Perhaps he would yell, "Where's the key? Where's the key?" or a few gallant encouragements, such as, "I'll get you out somehow." Then he would leap to the main door and, beating on it a few times, deliver a few more yells before dragging up the ladders, for the fire by that time should be going very well. Or perhaps he would do none of these things, simply appearing to them like the answer to a prayer in the nick of time. He grinned. The only reason why he would not spare himself both time and energy by propping the ladders against the wall after the last guest had entered the library was that the twins would see them as they performed their task. it was imperative that they should not suspect the library to be inhabited, let alone gain an inkling of Steerpike's preparations. On this, the last occasion of his 3 visits to the library, he once again worked the lock of the side door and overhauled his handiwork. Lord Sepulchrave had been there on the previous night as usual, but apparently had suspected nothing. The tall bookstand was as he had left it, obstructing a view of and throwing a deep shadow over the handle of the main door, from beneath which the twisted cloth stretched like a tightrope across the 2-foot span to the end of the long bookshelves. He could now detect no smell of oil, and although that meant that it was evaporating, he knew that it would still be more inflammable than the dry cloth. Before he left, he selected 6 volumes from the less conspicuous shelves, which he hid in the pine wood on his return journey, and which he collected on the following night from their rain-proof nest of needles in the decayed bole of a dead larch. 3 of the volumes had vellum bindings and were exquisitely chased with gold, and the others were of equally rare craftsmanship, and it was with annoyance, on returning to the prune squalors that night, that he found it necessary to fashion for them their neat jackets of brown paper and to obliterate the grown crest on the fly-leaves. It was only when these nefarious doings were satisfactorily completed that Steerpike visited the aunts for the 2nd time and re-primed them in their very simple role as arsonists. He had decided that rather than tell the prune squalors that he was going out for a stroll, he would say instead that he was paying a visit to the aunts, and then with them to prove his alibi, for somehow or other they must be got to and from the library without the knowledge of their short-legged servant, their story and that of the doctor would coincide. He had made them repeat 12 or so times, "We've been indoors all the time. We've been indoors all the time," until they were themselves as convinced of it as though they were reliving the future.